Amigas y amigos, bienvenidos a su podcast Decisiones que Cuentan. Te saluda, como todas las semanas, tu amigo y servidor Egbert Weatherborn. Como siempre te digo, y lo digo del corazón, muy contento de estar contigo nuevamente, trayéndote información de valor. Yo no sé si tú también, igual que yo, pero dándome cuenta que ya estamos a la mitad del año. ¿Qué tan rápido se ha pasado el año? Todavía me acuerdo cuando estábamos haciendo, no sé si te acuerdas tú, yo me acuerdo cuando estaba haciendo todas mis promesas de año nuevo y ya estamos en la mitad del año. Ya Decisiones que Cuentan está a unos 3-4 meses de cumplir su primer año. En fin, ha pasado muy rápido, pero aquí seguimos. Seguimos semana tras semana trayéndote información de valor, información que puedes utilizar para poder informarte mejor y tomar tus decisiones de negocio, ya sea que estés trabajando en una empresa o estés por emprender o ya emprendiendo tu negocio. El día de hoy, y sí, que todos los otros programas, tenemos un programa espectacular, pero espectacular. Y espectacular porque la verdad es un tema que a mí me apasiona, del cual no soy experto, pero vamos a tener hoy aquí a una experta en un tema muy importante, es la transición que está viviendo el mundo de economía, en donde el Producto Interno Bruto y otros indicadores macroeconómicos eran los indicadores útiles para poder tomar las decisiones y poder medir el bienestar de un país, a una era, como le llamamos nosotros, la era de los GPTs. Ya se acuerdan en varios programas los GPTs, ustedes han escuchado de ChatGPT, GPT, Generative, Pre-Trained Transformer. Un tipo de computadoras, de sistemas informáticos muy inteligentes que a través de un tema o de algo conocido como las redes neurales tienen la capacidad de anticipar, de predecir la siguiente frase en cualquier oración. Es un sistema muy afinado y no infalible, pero bastante bien preciso de poder adivinar la siguiente frase en una oración. Esa es la lógica, la tecnología detrás. Pero hoy tenemos en este programa a una experta en las ciencias económicas. Ella se llama Rachel Kim, que nos está acompañando desde Nueva York. La estoy por presentar, pero antes de presentarles, quiero hablarles de Rachel brevemente para que tengan una idea el nivel de profesional que vamos a tener hoy en Decisiones que Cuentan para ti, que has sido un seguidor leal a nuestro programa. Rachel es instructora de economía en la Universidad de West Point, específicamente el Departamento de Ciencias Económicas. Ella se graduó de esta misma institución de West Point en el año 2013 con una licenciatura en economía y una especialización en ingeniería de sistemas y fue comisionada durante sus años de estudios en el cuerpo de finanzas de esta institución. Luego, en el 2022, como si ya no era suficiente la formación que había recibido Rachel decide cursar en el 2022, repito, una maestría en administración pública por la Universidad de Columbia, donde se especializó en finanzas internacionales y políticas económicas, con una concentración en análisis de datos y análisis cuantitativo. Rachel ha tenido una serie de cargos durante su vida profesional. Se desempeñó como oficial de pagos en Vicenza, Italia, desde donde fue desplegada en Rumania, Kosovo, para implementar capacidades de comercio electrónico, cuentas contingentes respaldadas por el Tesoro con bancos regionales en la región de los Balcanes. Posteriormente se desempeñó como subdirectora de contabilidad para el 160 grados Regimiento de Aviación en operaciones especiales y luego como directora de contabilidad para el Batallón de Entrenamiento de Aviación de Operaciones Especiales en Fort Campbell. En fin, Rachel tiene una serie de ejecutorias que destacan, pero importante, no todo es solamente su trabajo. Ella es voluntaria activa en la Sociedad de West Point de Nueva York y en el capítulo de West Point de la Asociación del Ejército de los Estados Unidos, AUSA. Rachel, tuve la oportunidad de conocerla en un evento de una organización sin fines de lucro y logramos conectar y discutir una serie de temas interesantes, importantes sobre economía y desarrollo. Y sin más, quiero darle la bienvenida a Rachel Kim a nuestro programa. Rachel, welcome to Decisiones que Cuentan. How are you?
Muy bien. Estudiaba español durante la universidad, pero ahora yo voy a usar inglés.
Ok, oye, muy bien, Rachel. Se me había olvidado que habías estudiado español. Hablas muy bien, deberías practicar más. Sí. Bueno, Rachel, welcome again. Thank you for taking some time in your busy agenda to join us here at Decisiones que Cuentan. For everyone, you have these subtitles for the whole interview, so don't worry. You're gonna be able, if you don't speak English, you're gonna be able to understand our conversation by reading the subtitles. So, Rachel, the topic when I told you about, hey, Rachel, let's do it. Let's do an interview for Decisiones que Cuentan, or Decisions That Count, which would be the literal translation of our program. You said yes immediately, and I want to make it about something that it's interesting, that it's something about the things that are happening in our world today, all these changes that are taking place, and that many individuals around the world are having a difficult time to understand. And we decided we're going to call this program, this episode, From GDP to GPT, Growth in the Algorithmic Era. I want to start, Rachel, before we go into details about this topic, I want to know a little bit about Rachel, the human being. Rachel, this professional who was born in the U.S. to South Korean parents. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. How was it to grow in the U.S. to Korean parents, and how all your life in the U.S. has been from not only professional but cultural point of view as well?
Yeah, no, first, thank you so much for that introduction and for having me. For the audience, actually, we had met through a mutual friend who I had volunteered and participated, called the National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship. That is in short, it's called NIFTY. And so I, in my personal studies and curiosity, was very just interested in Panama as a next, were the areas of growth, at least from an international scale. And I just, for some reason, was looking into Panama, especially, the legacy of the canal and just kind of different social structures. And so my mentor, Arnie Abrams, who's your good friend, had actually lived there. So that's how I said immediately yes to the podcast, because I love talking about growth, but also just how it intersects across communities, and in the very serendipitous way that we had met at the gala. First, for just to get to know me on a personal level, I said I'm a second generation Korean American. My parents immigrated from South Korea in the 1980s. And I spent a lot of time thinking about communities. My father, when they first met, they immigrated from South Korea to California. But then my father decided there was a bigger calling, and he saw how doctors heals bodies, but he had a calling saying social workers, they heal societies. So he decided to pick up his entire life, drag my mom from sunny California to New York City in Manhattan to attend Columbia University School of Social Work. And since then, he has led a nonprofit. It's a Korean Community Services for the past 30 years. Because he saw a dire need to support immigrants and senior citizens back then in New York, where those services and those type of services and public, at least goods, were not provided by the government. And so he saw that market niche. And, growing up, I saw the role of the church and just very intensive education, investments in education. And then within one generation, I would say, just from a very homogenous and collective effort to rise in society, within one generation, the Korean American community improved their socioeconomic status. So I always was very grateful for the institutions in America that enabled this growth. As you know, post-war Korea was very, very poor, and they had their own growth model. But the fact that America allowed, myself to attend schools. In fact, I've never actually paid for my schooling. I'm a product of public education, public schools, and even just my sister, who she was also a public schools, attended public schools and went to Harvard. So, but basically subsidized because of the endowment. So all these things, just things I'm so grateful for in the institutions of America. I specifically grew up in Queens, New York. Have you ever been? If you've never been, specifically Flushing, New York, it's a bit of a chaotic place, I would say. I remember one time my friend was taking the train and woke up and he's like, where am I? Am I back in Asia? But there's just a beauty of it. It's not it's not the cleanest. It's definitely not the quietest. But it's so much of this hustle kind of culture, right? If you go, people are commuting from 4 a.m. to get to the city. This is about 30 minutes away from Manhattan. And if you kind of emerge from the trains at 4 p.m., you see all these first generation restaurant owners selling little to-go bento boxes, right? So there's always this kind of drive to survive and to grow and to always work. And I really appreciate that about Flushing, because from that generation is really what enabled their children, like myself, to achieve what we call success here in America. So I really use that as an example, growing up in Queens with my father's just inherent need to serve societies and communities, and how that's the baseline really of my identity. So I ended up deciding to really pursue the public sector in my 20s. I was a bit of a tomboy growing up, so I just really loved the structure and the mission of West Point. And so since then, I've now wanted to apply my other love of economics to help solve some of our more complex problems.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for sharing, this fascinating, summary of your life. And, it's true what you're saying about all these opportunities that, you can find in this country, and that, would allow you to also give back. Give back to people, give back to the community. I think you have the example with your dad and what he's been doing since starting that nonprofit. But you know what? I want to go into, now that we have introduced you to our audience, I want to go into the main topic of our interview. And it's about rethinking economic growth. All my life, and I'm sure the life of many of the members of our audience, GDP, or PIB in Spanish, has been the way of measuring how good a country is doing. But we live in something that we are calling, for the purpose of this interview, the algorithmic era. So, it's an era that started many years ago, but, the exponential growth took place, around the 2000s. And that meant the creation of value in different ways, not only about creating physical stuff, but also virtual digital products. How would you personally define growth in the context of the algorithmic era?
Let me ask you a question. What do you mean by the algorithmic era? Or is that a different era that we're entering, or a tech era?
Actually, yes. For the purpose of our program, we are referring to, let's say, the digital era. Actually began many years ago with everything that generated as the product of creating the internet, the coming to being of the internet. But yes, now how value is creating more in a digital format than in a physical way. That's what we're referring when we talk about algorithmic era. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, the digital era is very different. And first off, GDP from the expenditure approach. I don't use this word often, but I hate the way we measure economic well-being and prosperity using the expenditure model. It's that is consumption. It's broken down into the most simplest components, right? It's consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports. So exports minus imports. And that investments, by the way, that's capital goods, right? That's not the financial markets. I think Bobby Kennedy said this in the University of Kansas, in saying that it is a measure of how much stuff we make. Let's not even include services, but all this it's just basically expenditure, right? Mainly in the U.S., consumption being the main driver. But if you're really looking at the measure or the health of an economy, right, there are other indices must be observed. If you really think about the labor force, right, how are we educating them? What is the income distribution, the Gini, we call it the Gini coefficient? What is the socioeconomic mobility, right? And so I'm more obsessed nowadays with the GDP model from the production side. Not so much how we spend, but what are we actually looking at, the components and the factors of production. There's a model that we use called Cobb-Douglas, but it's, if I were just kind of verbally show it, but it's Y being just national income equals A A being that scalar outside of the function, exogenous to the model, so that's productivity. And the components are capital and labor. Right, there are other components too that other macroeconomists use, which is human capital, natural resources. Natural resources now in the modern economy, especially for the digital era, is not as important, as you can see from very natural countries endowed with natural resources in Africa as well as in Asia, right, are not thriving in the long term. So I like to boil it down to just capital and labor. And for that, it's how are we investing, right, in capital goods? How are we employing labor? How do we increase the labor force participation rate? Right. I think COVID unleashed a lot of new sources of labor, right? Just of the work from home productivity. I was in Japan. I go to Japan almost every year, and there's now a very fascinating concept of what disabled individuals can now participate in the labor force through robots, right? And so I like to think of it more as how do we look at more efficient operations, more productive workforces, and in growth, with a bit of a sharper vision, and how inclusive are our markets. But the most important thing in measuring growth is not necessarily those factors of production, but it's the productivity, it's that A, right? And I think the A is the multiplier of productivity, right? And what remains at the source of it, if you look at a lot of growth models, before they said it was the 5-year growth model was to just buy a lot of capital, right? But then we see from the Soviet Union that was actually did not understand diminishing returns to that, right? It actually didn't understand the productivity of labor. So more recently, right, it actually ends up becoming that the true source of long-term economic growth is human capital.
Okay.
And that doesn't just fall from the sky. You can't just purchase a ready-made workforce, right, or invent a culture of innovation overnight. So human capital must be nurtured through education, competition, a labor market that compensates investments into education. Also, a company that can, underwrite the costs or subsidize the cost for R&D, and the institutions that protect and reward all of that. And without that, you really don't have any growth. And so, speaking of the digital era and AI, right? Interesting to see if it's a good or a service, but that is that next kind of A, scalar component, the thing that will really drive growth. In history, we've seen this, whether it's fire, the wheel, or the Gutenberg Bible, scientific assembly. These are some eras in our history of this exogeneity that made both labor and capital much more productive. And we have a very unique inflection point in this algorithmic era because, first off, AI it's hard to tell what, is it a good or a service? And second, what's the ROI for this? But we can definitely, I guess, all agree that it is basically that new component for A. And the bottom line is, and I want to kind of talk about this, but I love to travel, right? I put Flushing, Queens, and New York in the US in this rosy model, but it's not. The counterfactual, as I said, of us growing up in America, South Korea has now, in the past 50 years, from the poorest country in Asia to now the 10th economy, right? And the reason I love to travel and the beauty of my job is that, and I've been to like 70, 80 countries, is that I can see what the counterfactuals are. I like going to emerging markets and frontier markets specifically. And it's just an observation of how is labor? How do people think? How competitive are markets? What is our level of capital markets? What is the individual's access to credit and savings? And the main important thing is what is the level of trust in institutions? Because to really create a thriving community, right, therefore a thriving city and their thriving economy, is you need a baseline of these institutions. The most recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, Asimoglu, it's MIT professor, right? He ascertained that the driver of long-term economic growth is institutions, so one that protects contracts, property rights, and free markets, right? And then all under the factors of production, that is what drives true long-term growth. So if we're thinking about what is growth in the algorithmic era, it is, yes, AI, but it has to be governed by good institutions.
Yep. Yes, 100%. I agree. I agree with you. And actually, that takes me to my next question. Because I feel that many small and developing economies still rely on traditional industries. I can see it, in my country, Panama, which 75% of the GDP comes from this, the tertiary sector, economy. Basically the Panama Canal and all the ports and logistical infrastructure around the Panama Canal. So what policies, based on your experience and your knowledge in this field, can help countries that still rely on oil industry to leapfrog into the algorithmic age without deepening inequality, which is also one of the fears, people staying behind and not being able to jump into this wave of growth and exponential benefit for the economies of the countries.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good question of how we can still include everyone, right? Include developing and small and developing economies in this new era of growth, because there are always going to be in the past when we have grown and the world is much healthier and wealthier, many are still left behind, right? And these are countries that are stuck in perpetual poverty. But I do think, though, it is a bit more of a Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? So, what's the point of investing in AI if your labor force is dying in education and uneducated, right? In fact, when you have areas of high unemployment, and so I bring back to a travel example, but for example, when I go to some of these, I say frontier markets, maybe a nice hotel, but the service industry, there's 10 people just hanging around doing a job for one person, right? To get my bag, to get my water, and these are all individual tasks that someone is to do, all seeking their tip. Or I was just hiking Kilimanjaro, for which one other person. I took a crew of 10 people, right? Which obviously I don't think we needed 10 people. So that to me is you have a large labor force that's unemployed. You can even call it high unemployment. And I am more concerned in countries where there's a high unemployment rates with young people, right, with the youth. And I think it's more important to think about how we include them in the local economy, and right, and then also how then we can be inclusive in the global economy once the investments are made in AI or the algorithmic era. And it's a little bit different, right, of how you can employ labor. And for me, I just always bring it down to capital is one thing, but I really bring it down to labor, again, from the human capital component as that growth for long-term economic growth. And I personally think, again, with the Maslow hierarchy of needs, there's a bit of a timeline for it, whether it's the institutions, then having a codified strategy, policies to decide how you're going to get capital. And I mean like money, liquidity, right? You need a solid middle class for tax revenue. If you don't have that, a lot of countries in emerging markets have relied on FDIs, foreign direct investments. So you make your country ripe for investment, right? Whether it's devaluing your currency, right? And then therefore you're much more of an export-driven economy. That's what China employed. But after that, then you build a current account surplus, right? Because now you have more exports and imports. And then you can now reinvest that. How you reinvest that is then, I think, the death knell for a lot of economies who want to figure this out, because you have to invest it back in the people. And that's when you can, now equip them with education, right? Address other things like health, because that is also a component of the productivity of our workforce. And so I think it's all very heterogeneous growth models. And I think, just going back to South Korea and the Miracle on the Han, that was the government policy. When after the Korean War, South Korea was decimated, and the government had a full-scale strategy to bring that river, it's called the Han River in Seoul, just war-torn, to the city it is now, right? And it was not just, let's make it an export-driven economy, right? They had codified and aligned strategies with education. The department of their equivalent Department of Education they subsidized pretty much. They ensured 100% literacy across their population, and then subsidized early education for all South Korean children. They also had a strategy to bring villages to cities, so deliberately bring them out of agrarian economies to now, let's say in this scenario, an algorithmic, right? Yeah. So cities are kind of these clustering effects for human capital, and so they want to take them out of agrarian economy. And then they did receive aid, foreign aid from the U.S. after the Vietnam War, but instead of just instead of just keeping it, I would say they reinvested that into critical infrastructure, because critical infrastructure, bridges and roads, right, that enables trade. And so I think once all of those components and that foundation is laid with good policies to ensure that, first off, you have a solid plan for gaining capital, how are you incentivizing it, and then simultaneously investing in your workforce, in your population, and then subsidizing critical infrastructure. That's the role of policy and government, right? And then you just don't, like, markets are efficient, but they're not perfect for redistribution, or they're not perfect for the efficiency or welfare effects. So they also have to kind of figure out, how do we reinvest some of our economy into these things that are not produced by the markets. We call those positive externalities, right? Things that are good for society, but not necessarily, captured in the market. And so that's the role that government can provide in ensuring that there's, people still, and they still have inclusive markets, and that they're not left behind.
Okay.
And so for AI and tech and all these different components of the digital economy, right? They're all tools for problem solving, and it really, let's use that example. It starts out with building the digital infrastructure, right? Again, going back to that, electricity and roads, because it's not just designing, hey, we want to invest in this. It's also just critical infrastructure and factories. In addition, again, with the institutions, you need rule of law, right? Financial inclusion to ensure, again, there's markets that can, absorb some of this. Startup pathways and tech that solves just real world problems. And so I think the innovative culture that, you seek in Silicon Valley or Shenzhen or say now, wherever you think of where there's innovation centers, right? I think that all happens at the tail end, but for developing in small economies, there's a bit of a different recipe for it, but it can definitely get there if it's kind of a whole of society approach with capital, educated labor, and good institutions, and then enabling the human capital markets to really deploy this marketplace for innovation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your detailed explanation, Rachel. I really, it's fascinating, these angles from the economic point of view, and I hope our audience is staying with us and, are understanding what we are sharing with them, because it's valuable information. I have a couple of questions before we finish our program. The first one is, we all know that GPT models can analyze and process information at scale, like as, never seen before in our, world and economies in general. What role, if any, Rachel, do you think governments should play in regulating this while still fostering innovation? What are your thoughts about, all these powerful tools that we have available, but hey, there might be some level of controls that we want to put in them, and how do we do it without affecting growth and innovation in our economies?
Yeah, that's always a very delicate tension, because the market, you don't want to have government intervention, right? There's deadweight loss once you incorporate that, and you still want to foster this exogenous. I say exogenous, but you can't predict, right? There's no strategy for innovation. It's just smart people and creative people coming together and finding the access to capital, someone to invest in, and then a market to deploy, right? That's how we really flesh out the entire innovation market. In terms of what governments can play, I think there are two things. First, as I said, the underlying factor of long-term growth is institutions, but really it's to provide incentives, for one, and second, it's to underwrite some of the risks, right? Subsidizing markets that are underproducing. To go back to the idea of positive externalities. And for instance, take a look at Elon Musk, right? He's the founder of Tesla, but I don't know if everyone knew, but in the 80s, Tesla was almost bankrupt, right? On the verge of bankruptcy. And despite his current initiative with reducing government inefficiency, Tesla survived on a government loan from the Department of Energy. And it's, the debt markets that is, I think, unique to the United States, in which it enabled the company to scale, right? They just needed a little bit of a win, which the government did. And so that's one way, right? Instead of stifling innovation in that capacity, right? Use policy by loans and loan repayments at a very low rate.
Yeah.
Provide incentives for instance, for Abu Dhabi, right? They have more of a policy of if you build it, they'll come. They provide a tax incentive for U.S. companies to then be based there, right? Which hence now we have this UAE-US agreement for AI campuses there. And so I think bottom line is if you see there's a public good, right, that's not being produced by the markets, then government's role is to subsidize. And it's also to subsidize things that have a spillover effect for the rest of society. And I'm not just an example, but OpenAI, right? That is an example of this public good because it's founded with the principle that it should be accessible, beneficial to all, right? And so they have ensured to, again, this is not government policy, but there's nonprofit oversight to ensure that the products of OpenAI are used to benefit the public. And so I think I'm getting to your question, right?
Yeah. No. Actually, you did. And we're gonna have to do a part 2 because this topic is fascinating. We ran out of time, unfortunately, but I want to finish the interview. Well, first, just if you want to give, there's a lot of people who are afraid about what's happening in today's world, and they feel that they might end up, having no way of surviving, professionally speaking. Just in 30 seconds, what would be your message as an economist to those individuals who have some fear about what could be coming or happening for them, considering all these shifts in skills and the reskilling needs that many people are experiencing at this moment?
Why be scared? I think everything is an opportunity, right?
Okay.
So structural unemployment is not bad. I think it's more important to see how we can incentivize policy to create a higher value. Displaced workers, obviously not good, but we need to have a creation of high value tasks, right? That's always kind of emerges from these eras when we have these technological changes. So don't be scared. I think it's an opportunity to learn new skills because that's just how the labor market improves. And there's no AI skill necessarily because that always changes as well. But think about really what your comparative advantage is, right? How you can provide an analysis or whatever your trade is. Yeah, if it's automative, then AI probably can replace it. But think of that as a tool, right? As something that makes you more productive as opposed to something that's going to displace you. Because that comparative advantage is a human component, right? It is your voice, your ethical leadership, your ability to reason and put two things together that perhaps an AI model can't. So leverage on that and then use AI as a tool in whatever capacity to make you a better person, an analyst or a better, individual. So I think it's not healthy to think of fear, but more of an opportunity.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rachel. I don't know, Edwin, if we have enough time. Okay, we have 2 minutes. 2 things. First, I wanna give you a present because we give a present to all of our guests, and it's a beautiful mug from Decisiones que Cuentan. But I just need one thing. I need you to tell us what's the slogan of Decisiones que Cuentan.
It's dare to create your own luck. Atreverse a crear tu propia suerte.
Muy bien, eso, es el español. Qué bueno, gracias. Thank you so much, Rachel. We may need to do a second part because I'm sure there are many people who still want to know more about your takes. I have some more questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Thank you, Rachel, again for being here today with Decisiones que Cuentan. I wish you all the best. Hope we can catch up soon. And al resto de nuestras audiencias que están aquí con nosotros, gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy. Y recuerden, como siempre les digo, atrévete a crear tu propia suerte. Nos vemos.